we've seen that three founding members of ECOWAS, of course, in the 1975 foundation of the ECOWAS bloc, we're talking Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger Republic. In recent times, they have been overtaken by coups, and as a result of that, you know, suspensions, I beg your pardon, from ECOWAS and several other really dire sanctions put on them. Just about 2 days ago now, we saw them step out with their military leaders to say that they seek to exit the ECOWAS bloc. Of course, we saw ECOWAS immediately respond that they had not gotten any form of official notification, of which they have now come together to send an official, information to ECOWAS. Now, this reeks of so many concerns in the first place. Is West Africa beginning to lose its center? In the overall, what are your thoughts before we get right into it?
So, in as much as Nigeria historically is the regional hegemon or the center, as you put it, of West Africa, then yes, West Africa absolutely is losing that center because I think it's been clear for some time now that, especially within the francophone bloc of West Africa, there has been a lot of discontent. Um, I think it's important to point out that the ECOWAS bloc is overwhelmingly a francophone one. So the English-speaking countries within the ECOWAS bloc are Nigeria, Ghana, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia. Right? And then the vast majority of the remaining are francophone, and then I think there's a lusophone in there. I think a third, but that's it. So overwhelmingly, this has always been a French-speaking bloc for the most part, and the English-speaking part of ECOWAS would be a minority were it not for Nigeria, which happens to be this very like oversized, outsized influence in terms of population, in terms of the size of the economy. So that has always placed Nigeria in a sort of uniquely difficult situation within the ECOWAS region because it's the most powerful player within ECOWAS by far, but it's also on its own not necessarily powerful enough to basically control the rest of the region, especially given that there is that core divergence. You know, the francophones, as we know, tend to stick together. They have their own agreements among themselves that are completely separate from ECOWAS. And then even within the ECOWAS region, there have been interconnectivity issues between Anglophone and Francophone. So, for example, it happens very often that if you're traveling, for example, from Lagos to Abidjan, using an ECOWAS travel certificate, which is like a little passport-like document, you're not supposed to have a problem doing that. You can easily travel from Lagos to Accra doing that. But if you're doing Lagos to Abidjan or Lagos to Bangui in Guinea doing that, you're going to have a problem. You know, even though it's supposedly the same block. There are also issues with interconnectivity within the banking system. There are issues with movement of goods. You know, ECOWAS is supposed to be a customs union. In practice, it doesn't really work out that way a lot of the time. There are all these teething issues historically. So already, it was a very imperfect union, and Nigeria was already in a in a relatively difficult situation trying to head this union. But what I think served as the tipping point was the decision of the Nigerian president, who is also the ECOWAS chair last year, to engage in this completely reckless and unnecessary saber rattling regarding the possibility of carrying out a military invasion into Niger following their military coup. Now, bear in mind that whether or not Niger is a member state of ECOWAS, all member states of ECOWAS remain sovereign countries in their own right.
Yeah.
If something happens inside a sovereign country, and it's not as if the country has fallen apart, it's not as if there is some massive instability there that threatens the stability of the rest of the bloc. There has been an internal political event in that country, in this case, a coup, right? The new coup regime has come in, and the country is still more or less relatively stable, right? It's not as if the coup regime has been rejected by the people, and then people are getting shut down in the streets, that kind of thing. That doesn't happen, right? The coup has been, to all intents and purposes, successful. Everybody has moved on. It is not the job of ECOWAS or any member states of ECOWAS to then start proposing military action to force a sovereign state to reverse the decisions that are in its own internal political decisions. That's not anybody's job. However, on the instigation of international partners, the likes of France and the US, France especially, Tinubu's calculation was if he could build a reputation as the Nigerian president who quote unquote restored democracy to a country which had just gone through a military takeover, then somehow that buys him some sort of leeway, that buys him some legitimacy with foreign powers. Bear in mind that at the time this was happening, he was going through an unprecedented challenge of legitimacy in the Nigerian court system after his heavily disputed supposed electoral victory. So in the first place, the decision to threaten military action against a neighbor which geographically is even bigger than Nigeria, but population-wise is about 10% the size of Nigeria. That decision wasn't even made locally. It wasn't even a West African decision. It's a decision that was made in Paris, and then it was basically delivered to for all intents and purposes, a colonial subaltern in Abuja, who then tried to push it through. So if I were the military if I were the military head of state in Niamey or in Bamako or in what's the other country in Burkina Faso,
Yeah.
in Ouagadougou, I'd be looking at these events and thinking, wait, hold on. So what gives you the right, especially given that this person who is doing all this saber rattling, you yourself, the method by which you came into office in Nigeria, how exactly? So I used a gun to come into office. I didn't kill anyone. It was a bloodless coup, right? You came into office through what some have termed a democratic coup, and people actually died in the process of you coming into office in that manner, which has been very widely and very heavily disputed. And yet somehow, because I'm wearing a uniform and you are wearing civilian clothing, somehow you think you're more credible than I am, and you have this thing called democracy on your side. Even when people would argue that there was absolutely nothing democratic about how you came into the office, even according to the official vote figures in your country, over 60% of the electorate did not vote for you. They voted for other candidates. That's the official numbers, the official INEC numbers. Over 60% of the electorate chose other candidates, did not choose you. So, yeah, and that's not even taking into account the fact that even the supposed victory you have is heavily disputed. Some even say you shouldn't even have been allowed to be on the ballot for a number of legal reasons. So, why on earth are you then pointing your country's gun at me and telling me that I don't have a right to take the actions that I took in my country? Also, bearing in mind that there's a context to these military coups, which I think a lot of people always seem to miss. It wasn't just a regular old case of, oh, the military got tired because they have not eaten and they feel like it's their turn and they went and they seized power. It wasn't just that simple narrative. In the case of these three countries, they have a long-standing problem with jihadi violence. They have also been dealing with Boko Haram and AQIM and ISWAP like we have. But unlike us, they were heavily constrained by the presence of the French military in their countries. In Mali, for example, there was an entire enclave within Mali which the Malian military was not allowed to enter by the French military. The French military had a base of operations there, and the French military actually prevented Malian security forces from accessing an entire district within the country where the jihadis were operating. And meanwhile, the jihadi violence was getting worse. So if you're a Malian military operative, what would you be thinking? That I have a foreign military presence in my country, which is preventing me from solving my own or trying to solve my own security issues. And the security issues are getting worse. So what should I do? I need to get rid of them. And the only way to get rid of them is to get rid of the administration that has signed whatever pact it has signed with France that keeps those soldiers there. So I need to overthrow this administration, call it a military coup, to solve this problem. That was the context. So against that backdrop, for you to now have a Nigerian president who lacked legitimacy now coming to threaten me with military action, that the message that and then using the fig leaf of ECOWAS to give that thing legitimacy, right? What that tells me is that ECOWAS itself has been, fundamentally infiltrated and is no longer fit for purpose. I would leave. And that's exactly what these three nations have done. And by the way, here's a prediction: they're not going to be the last. They're not going to be the last. So, of the 15 member states of ECOWAS, three have left now, so that leaves 12. My prediction is that by the end of the year, there might be 10 or 9 member states left in ECOWAS. And the issue, the overarching issue from a strictly Nigerian, from a selfish Nigerian perspective now, the issue with all of this is, so Nigeria has 4 borders, right? Chad, Niger, Benin, and Cameroon. Cameroon and Chad are part of the Central African bloc. So it has been Niger and Benin, which are the ECOWAS neighbors, and Niger has by far the longest border with Nigeria that of any country. Now you have essentially turned Niger, which was previously one of Nigeria's closest economic and diplomatic partners, into an enemy, like an outright enemy, an enemy that actually chases your president out of its airspace. You've done that to Niger now, and Niger is no longer part of the regional bloc which you are part of. You no longer exert as much influence over Niger as you used to. That's a massive own goal. Now, Nigeria's geographical connection with the rest of ECOWAS depends entirely on Benin Republic, which, by the way, also happens to be a francophone country. So essentially, one man's reckless series of statements and decisions and actions has placed Nigeria now in a situation where 3 of Nigeria's borders are now controlled by non-ECOWAS, non-friendly countries. And the 4th border is now entirely dependent on a francophone country, which could at any point decide to, to adopt a closer relationship with its francophone brethren who have left. So was there really any need to put Nigeria in this situation?
So the thing is, we are absolutely out of time. We've even borrowed from, time that is not ours. Just in a space of a minute that I can actually beg for, what do you think is the existential impact of these cessations? You have just cited a really strong impact on Nigeria, but holistically on the ECOWAS bloc, if you can squeeze it into a minute, what are we looking at? You've mentioned 2 issues. More people might be leaving, how it affects Nigeria. What else are we looking at with regards to this move?
Well, what we're looking at is a fundamental weakening of whatever economic and governance structures we have managed to build at a supranational level across West Africa. So freedom of movement, for example, which was already, more, it wasn't really something that was happening in practice compared to how much we talk about it. That's going to be even more difficult now.
Okay.
The interconnectivity of our financial systems and our economies, that's going to suffer. Ease of trade, that's going to suffer. Ultimately, we're all going to pay an economic price. And that's the economic price that happens when a group of regionally connected economies start to silo themselves off from each other instead of coming together, which has always and should always have been the goal of West Africa and Africa as a whole.
All right. I wish we had more time to break this conversation down, but you have already made lots and lots of revelations. Thank you so much, David Hundeyin, as international investigative journalist, for coming on Rise and Shine this one. We'll definitely be calling on you again as we see how these issues progress.
Thank you for having me.